Alaska is not just a land of glaciers and endless forests. It is a place where people disappear as if the earth itself swallows them up. Tourists, scientists, entire families, they venture into the wild and never return. There, torn tents are found with no signs of a struggle, backpacks hanging from treetops, shoes with the laces removed, and belongings neatly arranged in places where no human could have reached them. And every time, there are no clues or answers. What are these lands hiding? Why do experienced tourists and explorers who know all the rules of survival disappear without a trace in the mountains and tundra? Today, we will tell you about 3 disappearances, each of which became not just a tragedy, but a mystery that frightens even the most seasoned rescuers. Let's start with the story of Fred Larson, an engineer and experienced traveler, who in the summer of 1987 set out on a solo hike at the foot of Mount Ilya and was never seen again. Fred Larson was 36 years old. He was no stranger to the wilderness. A civil engineer from Oregon, he spent every vacation in the mountains. He was an experienced solo hiker, methodical and cautious. He knew how to read a map, how to handle a weapon, and most importantly, how to respect the wilderness. Alaska was his lifelong dream. In June 1987, he finally realized it when he flew into Port Ellsworth. This tiny village serves as the gateway to Lake Clark National Park. His plan was ambitious but feasible for someone of his skill level. A 3-day solo hike along a little-known route at the foot of Mount Ilya. On the morning of June 14th, he checked in at the ranger station as required. He left a copy of his itinerary, indicated his expected return date, June 17th, and slinging his well-worn backpack over his shoulder, set off. When Fred didn't return on the 17th, no one panicked. In places like this, a day or two delay is typical. A small river can swell after rain and cut off the way back. A slight illness can force a tourist to wait out the day in a tent. But when he didn't show up on the 19th and his name didn't appear on the list of passengers departing from Port Ellsworth, the Rangers sounded the alarm. The search operation began from the air. Pilots of small planes circled for hours over Fred's presumed route, scanning the endless green carpet of the taiga. It was an almost hopeless task. Finding one person in this ocean of trees was like looking for a needle in a haystack. Days passed with no results. Hope faded with each sunrise. Then, on the 10th day after his disappearance on June 24th, the pilot of one of the search planes spotted something. It was a small, barely discernible patch of unnatural color in a forest clearing. When the helicopter with the rescuers landed nearby, they realized they had found Fred's camp, and what they saw immediately alarmed them. The small single-person tent stood on level ground, but one of its walls had been torn open. It was not a neat cut made with a knife. The fabric was torn and stretched as if something large and powerful had broken through it. Inside the tent was a mess. An empty sleeping bag lay crumpled at the entrance, as if someone had jumped out of it in a panic, in an instant. A flashlight lay nearby, still on. The batteries were dead, but the switch was in the on position. This suggested that something had happened during the night, but the strangest thing was what wasn't in the tent. There were no traces of blood, no scraps of clothing. There were no signs of a struggle inside, and more importantly, there were no traces around the tent. The ground was covered with soft moss that would have preserved any footprints, from a heavy human boot or a bear's paw. But the moss was untouched. It seemed that whatever had torn the tent apart had not walked on the ground. Experienced rangers immediately thought of a grizzly bear. The tear in the tent looked like a claw mark. A sudden awakening in the night, panic. It all fit. They began combing the area for signs of the predator. They found nothing. Not a single paw print. Not a single scratch on the trees. No droppings. Nothing to indicate the presence of a large animal in the area. Then one of the rescuers, scanning the edge of the forest, looked up and froze. "Guys, you should take a look at this," he said over the radio, his voice filled with bewilderment. About 50 feet from the camp, at the very top of a tall old spruce tree, hung Fred's backpack. It was hanging at least 30 feet high. One of its straps was neatly hooked onto a sharp piece of broken branch near the trunk. The backpack hadn't been thrown up there. it would have gotten tangled in the lower branches. It had been placed there deliberately. The backpack at the top of the tree became the central element of this mystery. It wasn't just a piece of evidence. It was a symbol of the absolute irrationality of what had happened. To reach it, one of the most experienced rangers, a professional tree climber, had to use special equipment. When he lowered the backpack to the ground, the mysteries deepened. First, the tree trunk was smooth without any hooks or scratches. There were no traces of bear claws that could have climbed up there. There were also no traces of climbing equipment or human boots. No one and nothing had climbed this tree from the ground. Second, the contents of the backpack. It was almost complete. Inside were Fred's documents, his wallet with money, a route map, a compass, a lighter, and a small supply of food. Everything was there. This ruled out robbery, but most importantly, his Ruger Super Blackhawk .44 caliber revolver was in its holster, in the side pocket. It was a powerful weapon, capable of stopping a bear. It had not been used. All 6 bullets were still there. The man who had panicked and rushed out of the tent at night did not take the weapon with him, which was in his backpack. Instead, the backpack somehow ended up on top of a tree. The official version of the bear attack began to fall apart. Yes, a bear could have torn the tent apart, but it wouldn't have hung the backpack neatly on a tree. It would have torn it to shreds in search of food. It would have left traces. And surely, if a bear had dragged Fred away, there would have been drag marks and blood on the ground. But there was none of that. The search continued with renewed vigor, now with a focus on the criminal angle. Perhaps Fred had encountered poachers or illegal miners, but this version did not explain the key details. Why would criminals kill a tourist and then spend time and effort hanging his backpack on a tree? It was a senseless and risky move. Days turned into weeks. Search parties combed the area square by square. Then, 3 weeks after the camp was discovered, a group of volunteers made their final discovery. About a mile from the camp, in a marshy hollow, they found Fred's hiking boot. It was half submerged in the mud. It was laced up. The foot inside was missing. Forensic experts examined the boot and found no teeth or claw marks. The leather was intact. The foot had simply been removed without damaging the boot. That was the last thing ever found belonging to Fred Larson. His body was never found. The case was at a dead end. Despite all the inconsistencies, the official conclusion was missing, presumed dead, as a result of a bear attack. It was a convenient and straightforward explanation that allowed the case to be closed. But none of those who worked on the case believed it. In private conversations, the Rangers discussed another, far more disturbing possibility. They talked about something else living in those woods, not a bear and not a man. The local Danina Indians tell legends of hairy people, or Nantunik, creatures that look like humans but are covered in fur, possess enormous strength and can move through the forest without leaving a trace. They are known for occasionally stealing from people or spying on them from a distance. They are usually not aggressive, but sometimes. Could something like this have taken an interest in Fred's camp? Could it have used its strength to tear down the tent and then, out of curiosity or some kind of incomprehensible logic, throw the backpack up into a tree? This version explains the lack of footprints, if the creature moved through the trees, the incredible height at which the backpack was found, and why no weapons were used. Perhaps it all happened so quickly that Fred simply didn't have time to react. We will never know the truth. The story of Fred Larson is not just a report about a missing tourist. It is a story about an encounter with something that does not fit into our picture of the world. Something powerful, intelligent, but operating according to a logic entirely alien to us. Something that can tear your refuge apart, and then, as if to mock you, hang your backpack on top of a tree, leaving rescuers and investigators completely baffled. But these are just guesses from a myth, with no objective evidence to back them up. Dr. Samuel Holloway was a man of science. As a field biologist specializing in Arctic ecosystems, he was accustomed to order, data, and logical conclusions. Nature was a complex but knowable system to him. In September 1995, he and his 17-year-old son Elias set up a small research camp in the upper reaches of the Noatak River. Their task was to collect samples of mosses and lichens to study the effects of climate change. For Samuel, it was work. For Elias, it was an adventure. He had grown up on such trips, was experienced and responsible beyond his years, had an excellent sense of direction in the wilderness, and was an indispensable assistant to his father. October 3rd was unusually calm for that time of year. A light snow fell during the day, covering the tundra with a thin, pristine layer several inches thick. By evening, the sky had cleared and there was no wind. The temperature dropped to 24.8 degrees, cool, but quite comfortable for Alaska. Father and son finished their work, had dinner in their heated tent, and prepared to process the day's samples. Around 7 in the evening, Elias got up and said he wanted to take a short walk. "I'll walk over to the weather station and check the gauges. I'll be back in 20 minutes, he said. The weather station was only a couple of hundred yards from the camp, a simple structure consisting of a tripod and a few instruments. It was a routine, daily task. Elias put on his boots and a warm jacket and left the tent. Samuel, absorbed in his work, didn't notice how time had passed. When he looked up from the microscope and glanced at his watch, it was almost 8. Elias was still not back. Samuel stepped outside the tent. The silence was absolute. Not just silence, but a vacuum. There was no sound of wind, no cry of a night bird, no rustling of grass. This ringing, unnatural silence made him feel uneasy for the first time. He called out his son's name. There was no answer. He grabbed a powerful flashlight and followed the tracks. They were clearly visible in the fresh snow, clear prints of his son's boots. The first thing Samuel noticed as a scientist was the nature of the tracks. They were perfectly straight. The steps were even, confident, with no signs of haste or panic. Elias didn't zigzag or look around. He walked in a straight line as if following a ruler toward a small stream flowing nearby. And here, at the very edge of this stream, Samuel Holloway, a man who believed in the laws of physics, encountered the impossible. His son's footprints led to the water's edge and ended. The stream was narrow, about 15 feet across. Due to the recent frost, it was completely frozen to the bottom. The ice was smooth, solid, and most importantly, covered with the same untouched layer of fresh snow. There was not a single footprint on it, nor were there any on the opposite bank. Samuel shone his flashlight in all directions. Elias's footprints did not veer to the left or right. They did not lead back. There were no signs that he had slipped or fallen. There were no dents, no traces of a struggle, nothing. Just a straight chain of footprints that reached the frozen creek and ended as if Elias had taken off vertically at that point. Overcome with horror, but still trying to think logically, Samuel crossed the creek back and forth several times. The ice was as hard as rock. He walked hundreds of yards up and down the stream. Nothing. Not a single crack, not a single gully where he could have fallen through. Not a single footprint on the other bank. Returning to the last footprint, he shone his flashlight on it again and again, trying to find some kind of explanation. But there was no explanation. That night, Samuel Holloway did not sleep. He heated up all the flares they had and fired them into the black, starless sky every half hour. In the morning, as soon as the satellite phone picked up a signal, he contacted the rescue service. His voice was calm, and he spoke like a scientist, stating facts. But behind that calmness lay the chilling horror of a father whose reality had been shattered. The rescue team arrived by helicopter at noon. It was led by Frank McGregor, a veteran of search and rescue operations in Alaska. He listened to Samuel's disjointed but accurate account and immediately headed for the creek. What he saw shocked even him. In 20 years on the job, he had seen dozens of tragic and strange cases, but never anything like this. It was like a picture from a magic trick, he said later. There were tracks, there was a barrier, and then nothing. Complete emptiness. We documented and photographed every inch. We brought dogs with us. And that was the strangest thing. 2 experienced search dogs confidently picked up the trail from the camp. They followed Elias's tracks precisely. But at the creek, where the tracks ended, the dogs stopped dead in their tracks. They began to whine, spin around, and then, with their tails tucked between their legs, tried to run back. They couldn't pick up the trail any further. They couldn't smell him on the ice, on the other bank, or in the air. Their behavior indicated not just a loss of the trail, but complete confusion and even fear. It was as if the source of the scent had simply ceased to exist at that point in space. The search continued for 6 days. Rescuers, volunteers, and rangers combed the area square by square. They found nothing, not a single clue, not a single discarded item. The weather, as luck would have it, was clear and calm, which made the lack of results even more ominous. Samuel Holloway, remaining at the camp, was slowly going mad with helplessness. He, a man who knew this nature, understood that his son could not have simply gotten lost. Something else had happened. On the 7th day, a helicopter pilot flying over the higher slopes spotted a piece of dark fabric on a gray scree slope. It was about 400 yards from the stream, but much higher up the hill, up a steep, difficult slope, where there was no point in going from where Elias had disappeared. The ground team reached the spot a few hours later. It was Elias's jacket, a heavy, warm parka. It wasn't just lying on the rocks. It was caught on a sharp ledge and covered with small stones. The jacket was dirty, stained with a dark substance, possibly mud or sludge despite the absence of nearby swamps, and it was torn. 3 long, parallel tears gaped on the back and sleeve. Experts who examined it later concluded that the tears did not resemble the marks left by the teeth or claws of a bear or wolf. The fabric had not been cut but torn, as if it had been stretched with incredible force in different directions. This discovery completely destroyed all rational explanations. Did she fall through the ice? The ice was intact? Was she attacked by an animal? There were no signs of a struggle, no blood. The dogs behaved strangely, and there was unusual damage to the jacket. Did she leave on her own? The tracks were straight and broke off. Why would he walk up a steep slope in the dark without a jacket in 4-degree frost? It defies the instinct for self-preservation. Kidnapping by a human, in one of the wildest and most deserted places on the planet, without a single trace of anyone else in the snow? Absurd. The phenomenon of paradoxical undressing, which sometimes occurs in severe hypothermia, didn't fit either. Elias had been gone too short a time to freeze to that extent, and it didn't explain how he had covered 400 yards of snow and rocks without leaving a single trace. The search was called off after 2 weeks. Elias Holloway was never found. The official report was short and vague, missing in the wilderness. In private conversations, rescuers said the case left them with a heavy feeling, a feeling of touching something beyond their experience and understanding. Samuel Holloway left Alaska a month later. He never returned to fieldwork. A man of science, he was left alone with a set of data that was impossible to systematize. A straight line of footprints in the snow leading to nothingness, the unnatural silence that enveloped the camp, and a torn jacket on a cold mountainside. These 3 facts shattered his world. The story of Elias Holloway became another quiet, unsolvable chapter in the vast book of unexplained disappearances. It serves as a reminder that in the great silence of the wilderness, there are phenomena for which humanity has yet to find laws or explanations. There are only questions and traces that end at a frozen stream. The Noatak National Wildlife Refuge in northwestern Alaska is one of the last truly wild places on the planet. It is not a park in the usual sense, with trails and campgrounds. It is 6.5 million acres of pristine, untouched land, where the geography still seems temporary and the presence of humans fleeting and out of place. In this land of rivers, mountains, and endless tundra, there are places where no human has ever set foot. And it was here, in the heart of this silence, that the Tom family arrived in the summer of 1981 to take the trip of their dreams. They did not know that this journey would turn into a never-ending nightmare, and that the name of their son, Arlen, would be added to the quiet but eerie list of those whom this land took without leaving a trace or an answer. Ray and Janice Tom were no strangers to adventure. Ray, a 42-year-old geologist, had spent most of his life on field expeditions. Janice, his 40-year-old wife, was a high school biology teacher and an avid hiker. Their 14-year-old son, Arlen, was the product of their love for the wilderness. From early childhood, they took him with them, teaching him how to pitch a tent, build a fire, read a map, and most importantly, respect, and understand a world where humans are only guests. Arlen was a quiet, observant teenager who preferred the silence of the forest to the noise of the city. A trip down the Kugarak River in the Noatak National Wildlife Refuge was to be his first severe, almost adult test. They had been preparing for this trip for nearly a year. They carefully studied maps, bought the best equipment available at the time, and planned their route. In early August 1981, a small seaplane dropped them off on the riverbank, where they began their journey. The first 2 days were exactly as they had imagined. Difficult crossings, breathtaking landscapes, and a feeling of complete unity with nature and with each other. They saw grizzly bears from a safe distance and herds of caribou passing through the tundra. Everything was going according to plan. On the evening of the third day, they set up camp on a dry, grassy spit by the river. The day was clear and warm. Ray built a fire while Janice prepared dinner. The sun was already sinking toward the horizon, painting the sky in incredible shades of orange and purple. They ran out of drinking water. Arlen, as he had done many times before, took 2 empty mess kits and a headlamp, even though it was still light enough. "I'll go to the river and get some water," he said. The river was only 30 yards from the tent, and its sound was clearly audible. "Okay, just be careful near the shore, it's slippery," Janice replied, without looking up from her cooking. "I'll be quick," Arlen said, and disappeared behind the low willow bushes growing near the water. Those were the last words they heard from him. 15 minutes in the everyday world is nothing. In the Alaskan wilderness at sunset, it can be an eternity. For the first 5 minutes, Ray and Janice weren't worried, but when 10 minutes passed and Arlen still hadn't returned, Ray put down the wood and called out, "Arlen, are you okay?" The only response was the sound of the river and the crackling of the fire. Janice felt a chill run down her spine. "Maybe he just decided to wash the pots," she said to her husband, but there was no confidence in her voice. When 15 minutes had passed, Ray grabbed his flashlight. "I'll go check," he said. He reached the water's edge in a minute. There was no one on the pebble beach. 2 pots stood at the water's edge, filled to the brim. Arlen was gone. Ray shone his flashlight around on the other side of the river. Nothing. He shouted his son's name, and his cry, full of alarm, was drowned out by the sound of the water. Janice ran up to him, her face white with fear. Together they began to comb the shore, looking into every shadow, every clump of bushes. They shouted his name over and over until they were hoarse. But there was no answer. The ground by the river was rocky, and there were no footprints. There were no signs of a struggle, no traces of blood, nothing that could indicate an animal attack. Their son, their 14-year-old boy, had simply disappeared, walking 30 yards away from the camp to fetch water. They didn't sleep that night. They built a massive fire and fired flares into the air. At dawn, Ray, following a prearranged emergency plan, turned on their emergency radio beacon, and the agonizing wait began. Rescuers were unable to reach them until late the next day. After listening to the disjointed story of the grief-stricken parents, they began a systematic search. The first 2 days yielded absolutely nothing. It seemed as if the boy had vanished into thin air. All hope rested on the canine search team, which arrived on the 3rd day of the search. It was then that this story began to turn from tragic to inexplicable. 2 specially trained German shepherds, designed for searching for people in the wild, easily picked up Arlen's trail near the tent. But the trail did not lead them to the river where the pots were. It led them in the opposite direction, to thick, almost impenetrable thickets of willow and alder, about 100 yards from the camp. The dogs followed the trail confidently, and the rescuers were already preparing to find the boy, wounded or frightened in the bushes. But about 10 yards before reaching the thicket, both dogs stopped abruptly. Their behavior changed in an instant. They whimpered, and the hair on their necks stood on end. They began to resist, refusing to go any further. The dog handlers, experienced professionals, tried to get them to move, but the dogs fell into a state close to panic. They growled, not at anything in particular, but at the thicket itself, and backed away, trying to break free from their collars. The rescuers were puzzled. They had never seen such a reaction. The dogs were not afraid of the smell of a bear or a wolf. They were trained to work in such conditions. They were fearful of something else. something that caused their instinct for self-preservation to completely override all commands. Arlen's trail led straight to these thickets, and then, judging by the dog's reaction, it either broke off or mixed with something that caused them to panic. After combing through the thickets foot by foot, the people found nothing. No traces, no clues, no Arlen. The search operation had reached its first, most bizarre impasse. The failure of the canine calculations was a turning point in the case of Arlen Tom's disappearance. Until that moment, the rescuers had been dealing with a tragic but potentially explainable situation. Now they were faced with something that did not fit into their years of experience. The atmosphere in the search camp changed. The professionalism remained, but it was mixed with an oppressive sense of anxiety, a feeling that they had entered a territory where different rules applied. The search became more cautious, with people looking around more often, listening to the silence between gusts of wind. On the fourth day of the search, one of the groups was methodically combing a wooded slope about half a mile from the camp. It was routine, exhausting work. Then one of the volunteers, a former soldier named Mike, stopped and looked up. Against the gray sky, he noticed a dark spot on the branch of a tall spruce tree. It was too regular in shape to be a nest or a cluster of pine needles. Using binoculars, he confirmed his hunch. It was a headlamp. The find was strange from the start. The headlamp was hanging from a thick, bare branch about 8 feet high. It hadn't just been thrown there. An elastic strap had been carefully looped over the branch, as if someone had taken it off their head and hung it up. To do that, someone as tall as Arlen would have had to either jump or climb something. But the ground beneath the tree was covered with a thick layer of untouched moss. There were no footprints, no broken branches. The tree trunk was smooth, with no scratches that boots would have left while climbing. The switch on the lantern was in the off position. This detail was alarming. A person lost in the woods at night does not turn off their only source of light, and certainly not hang it on a high branch where it would be difficult to reach. This action was devoid of survival logic. It was more like a ritual or a sign. But what did it mean? The rescuers searched every inch around the tree. There was nothing. No traces, no other items. Only this lone flashlight hanging silently above their heads. The search continued. Ray and Janice, whose faces had turned into gray masks of grief over the past few days, refused to leave the camp. They clung to a faint hope. But with each passing day, that hope faded, giving way to cold, sticky despair. On the 9th day, when the official search was about to be called off, another team made a final discovery. Far from where the lantern had been found, in thick bushes at the foot of an old tree, lay a boot, Arlen's boot. It was dry and clean, except for a few leaves stuck to it. It was not torn or damaged. The laces were completely untied. It lay as if it had been carefully removed and placed in the bushes. There was no sign of the other boot anywhere nearby. And again, as in the previous cases, there were absolutely no traces around it. This discovery was the last straw. It added another element to the picture that is characteristic of the strangest cases of disappearance: paradoxical undressing. But this did not resemble the actions of a person in hypothermia who, in agony, tears off their clothes. It was methodical. The flashlight was turned off and hung up. The boot was removed, unlaced, and placed back in its place. Every action was deliberate. But whose? 2 weeks later, the active search was called off. Arlen Tom was listed as missing. Ray and Janice left Noatak, taking with them a void that would never be filled. The official report, compiled later, was full of omissions and assumptions. The most likely version was an attack by a predator, despite the complete lack of evidence. It was the only way to close a case that had no rational solution. But the story did not end there. A year passed. The name Arlen Tom became another quiet tragedy in the history of Alaska. In the fall of 1982, a commercial hunter, an Inupiat Indian, was checking his traps in an area rarely visited even by locals. He was dozens of miles from the Tom family camp. To get there, he had to cross a river and climb a high, wind-swept plateau, a rocky desert where almost nothing grew. No tourist trails led to this place. Passing between two huge boulders covered with lichen, the hunter noticed a glint on the ground. He bent down and picked up the object. It was a simple handmade bracelet woven from colored threads and decorated with a small metal bead. Later, Janice Tom would recognize it. It was a gift she had made for her son on his 14th birthday, the bracelet he had never taken off. It lay on the ground exactly between two boulders, as if it had been placed there on purpose. The hunter, a man who had grown up in these parts and knew the language of nature, looked around. There were no bones, no scraps of clothing, no other signs of human presence. Only this small, man-made object in the heart of a vast, indifferent desert, on a plateau where a 14-year-old boy, even if he had survived, would never have been able to reach. This last discovery became the most chilling epilogue to the story of Arlen Tom. It confirmed once and for all that his disappearance was not the result of blind chance or a predator. It was a series of deliberate actions that were utterly alien to human logic. Water pots left by the river, a scent leading to bushes that dogs fear, a lantern hung 8 feet high, a single shoe, and finally a bracelet carried dozens of miles and left on top of a desert plateau. It didn't look like someone was covering their tracks. It looked like a chain of inexplicable details, a grim exhibition where the boy's personal belongings served as exhibits. It was as if some force or creature had not simply taken him away. Still methodically, step by step, he was dismantled, leaving his parents and rescuers with these unsolvable mysteries as the only thing they had left of their son. We will never know what happened to Arlen Tom during those 15 minutes by the Kugarak River. This story makes even the most ardent skeptics believe in something else. And that's it. These stories are just a small part of what Alaska hides. Here, people disappear in such a way that even experienced trackers and rescuers throw up their hands in despair. Logic breaks down, theories don't add up, and the clues found seem like a mockery of the human mind. If you liked the video, like it, subscribe, and write in the comments which of these stories you think is the scariest. There are more investigations and unexplained disappearances ahead. Don't miss them. See you next time.